For 6 years they waited. No trains, no jobs, just silence, rust settling over steel, and promises buried beneath budget cuts. 400 people stood shoulder to shoulder in the heat of a forgotten rail town, not for a ribbon cutting, but for an answer. Pete Buttigieg came with a speech. J.D. Vance came with a question. No theatrics, no podium. He simply stepped forward, looked Pete in the eye, and asked something so direct, so undeniable, that it didn't need to be repeated. Pete froze. The silence stretched. And then, before he could speak, a cheer broke out behind J.D. Not of joy, but of recognition. Finally, someone had said it out loud. What follows is a dramatized account inspired by truths that statistics can't measure. Frustration, silence, and the quiet grief of being ignored. These characters are fictional, but if you've ever felt unseen by the powerful, you already know this story is real. Because this story isn't just about trains. It's about who still gets left behind when they stop running. If you've ever felt forgotten, this isn't just a story, it's yours. There was a time when the town breathed in rhythm with the trains. Every morning at 6:12, the steel rails hummed before the whistle cried out. A long, proud note that echoed through the Appalachian Valley. That sound meant jobs. It meant food on the table. It meant the world was still paying attention. But now silence had a sound of its own. The half-built train station sat like a skeleton at the edge of town, its metal beams rusting under gray skies, its digital sign forever blinking 0000. Ivy crept up its unmanned walls like a quiet protest. Pigeons roosted where ticket windows were supposed to go. The platform was cracked in the middle, like the promise that put it there. The last construction crew left 18 months ago. Some say they were pulled out in the middle of the night. Others say they were never meant to finish. No one really knew, because no one ever called to explain. 12-year-old Noah Ellison passed the station every day on his bike, tires crunching over gravel that used to be pavement. He never looked directly at it, not anymore. But that day he stopped. He pulled out a folded notebook page from his backpack, wrote the final line, folded it carefully, then walked his bike the last 100 yards to the mailbox in front of the shuttered post office. There was no stamp, just one sentence written across the front in uneven pencil. To someone in Washington who still remembers us. Inside, the letter read, "My name is Noah. I'm in 6th grade. They said we would have trains by now. My dad got laid off waiting. He fixed his boots twice last year because he thought he'd be working track again. He doesn't talk much anymore. My mom says to be patient, but I don't think the trains are coming. Can you tell me why? Or just tell me you got this?" Noah didn't cry when he mailed it, but he did look back at the station, like he was trying to remember what it used to sound like. Across town, people didn't talk about the station anymore. They talked around it, at the diner, at the church, at the VFW hall. Still waiting had become a joke so old no one laughed at it anymore. They used to check the news. Now they just checked their heating bills. The funding had been announced with fanfare 6 years ago. A rural transit revolution, they called it. Pete Buttigieg stood in front of a podium with shiny renderings and used words like revitalize and restore. Then one day the updates stopped. The money stopped. The trains never came. And no one ever said why. But rumors, those came like clockwork. Some said the funds were redirected to a tech corridor outside D.C. Others whispered that Pete's department had reclassified the town as low ROI. One woman swore she saw a contractor take photos of the station, then disappear forever. No badge, no answers. And yet no one expected what would happen next. Because somewhere, hundreds of miles away, that letter did arrive. It didn't land in a pile of junk mail or get tossed by a clerk. It was opened, read, and it stopped someone in their tracks. That person was J.D. Vance. He read it alone late at night in an office with one light on and a coffee gone cold. And for reasons he didn't fully understand yet, the last line echoed in his mind louder than any campaign speech ever had. "Just tell me you got this." J.D. Vance read the letter 3 times before setting it down. It was nearly midnight in his Senate office, long after the staff had gone home and the Capitol had gone quiet. A stack of reports sat unread beside him. The air was stale with hours-old coffee, and the only light came from the dull glow of his desk lamp and the hum of C-SPAN playing a muted budget debate on loop. But nothing on that screen mattered compared to the 5 sentences now sitting in front of him, written in pencil on ruled notebook paper by a boy from a place that didn't make headlines. The handwriting wobbled in parts like the pen had been pressed too hard. JD could picture the kid, elbows on the kitchen table, tongue poking out in concentration, writing under a dim bulb while the sound of an old heater rattled in the corner. The line that stopped JD cold was near the end, just 6 words, simple, raw, real. We waited. They forgot. Did you? He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, letting the words settle like dust in his lungs. It wasn't just the content, it was the timing. He'd just left a closed-door meeting with 2 transportation aides who spent 20 minutes explaining why redistributing infrastructure funding toward urban density hubs was a sound investment. He'd nodded politely. He always did. But sitting there now, Noah's letter didn't sound like policy. It sounded like truth. His eyes drifted to the window. Washington slept beyond the glass, a city full of monuments and meanings. But in JD's mind, the marble vanished. And for the first time in a long time, he was back in Middletown. He remembered the sound of dishes clinking in the sink while his mother searched for a job that didn't exist. The late notices piling up in a shoebox on the fridge. His grandmother, Mama, cutting coupons in silence because food stamps never stretched as far as the politicians claimed they would. No camera crews ever came down their street. No one sent renderings or gave speeches about hope. They were a story America had already written and thrown away. That's what Noah's letter felt like. A message from the boy JD used to be. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the paper, eyes scanning the postmark. There was no contact number, no email, just a town name, a fading one. He reached for his laptop, typed the name into a search bar, and paused when the first result showed a headline from 6 years ago. Buttigieg announces rural transit expansion. JD clicked the link. Smiling faces, promises, graphics. Then silence. He kept scrolling until he reached the comments. Dead space on most political sites. But buried 3 pages down was one line from a user with no photo. My dad welded that platform. They said he'd retire there. JD closed the laptop softly and stared back at the letter. Something about this wasn't right. Not just the failed project, but the fact that no one seemed to care it failed. No hearings, no press, no outrage. Just silence, and the assumption that the people on the other end would forget, like they always did. But Noah hadn't forgotten, and JD couldn't either. He folded the letter carefully, not like a document, but like something sacred. Then he placed it in the center drawer of his desk, pausing only once before closing it. There were rules to follow, chains of command, political protocols, but none of them mattered as much as the feeling now burning in his chest. He whispered it to himself, not out loud, not for effect, just a promise made in the dark. We waited. They forgot. Not this time. He reached for his coat, turned out the light, and left the letter behind. Not because he was done with it, but because he was just getting started. The next morning, JD Vance stepped into his office with barely 4 hours of sleep behind him. The letter still echoed in his mind. It wasn't just the words, it was the stillness they left behind. The kind of silence that lingers long after a child speaks what adults are too proud to admit. They forgot us. He had planned to bury himself in committee schedules and draft revisions for a veterans housing bill, but his chief of staff was already waiting, tablet in hand, concern in her eyes. You're going to want to see this, she said quietly. On the screen, a live feed. Helicopter blades cut the air above a town with no moving trains, no mayoral press team, and barely enough cell signal to stream video. But there it was, clear as day. Pete Buttigieg stepping off the chopper onto red Appalachian soil, flanked by aides in tailored suits, camera crews in tow. The chyron across the bottom read, Secretary Buttigieg visits Hollow Ridge for transportation evaluation. Hollow Ridge. JD didn't need to read further. He knew the name. He'd memorized it. It was the return address on Noah's envelope. He watched as Pete adjusted his tie and smiled for the first shot. Aides handed out fact sheets with bullet points in federal jargon. Resilience zones. Rural readiness index. Next Generation Mobility Framework. The crowd looked thin. Assembled, not arrived. No families, no workers, no one who looked like they'd ever laid a rail line. JD's jaw tightened. The town had written a letter. The government sent a helicopter. He walked over to the window, let the curtain pull back just enough to see the city humming outside. Taxis, tinted SUVs, microphones angled toward whoever was speaking loudest that hour. He took a deep breath, then turned back to his staff. "I'm going," he said. She blinked. "Going where?" "To Hollow Ridge." "For what? A press conference?" JD shook his head slowly, not to speak, to listen. There was a pause, a long one. Then she nodded. Within an hour, he was behind the wheel of his own car. Not a black SUV, not a motorcade. No handlers, no podium, no notes. Just a battered leather duffel tossed in the back seat and a long road out of DC behind him. The radio was off. The window cracked just enough to let in the dry wind of early spring. He didn't know exactly what he'd find there. He wasn't planning to be seen, but something inside him refused to let this go the way every other forgotten promise had. Meanwhile, in Hollow Ridge, the sound of the helicopter hadn't yet faded when the first murmurs began to spread. Pete had visited the construction site, not the people. He had spoken to engineers, not welders. He had promised future assessments, not present answers. And as quickly as he had landed, he was being escorted to a prefab podium near the old station, where media were being positioned to catch his closing remarks. Noah stood across the street with his bike, watching the scene unfold from beside the rusted mailbox. He recognized Pete's face from news clips, but it looked different in person, smaller, further away. He clutched the corner of his backpack, wondering if this visit would matter, wondering if anyone would remember they had been remembered. But in that same hour, somewhere on a winding road just outside of town, J.D. Vance's tires met gravel. Dust rose. The air thickened. Two very different routes, one polished, one worn, were quietly, inevitably beginning to converge. One came from above, the other from below, and only one of them came to listen. The black helicopter circled once before descending. The sound was deafening, imposing, like a statement written in wind. Dust spiraled into the air, whipping the weeds and empty plastic bottles scattered across the abandoned parking lot that once served as the station's drop-off point. When the blades finally slowed, a line of SUVs slid into position with perfect choreography, and Pete Buttigieg stepped down onto Hollow Ridge. He adjusted the cuffs of his blazer, smoothed his tie, and offered a smile polished by years of press briefings and campaign rallies. State officials clapped too quickly. Cameras clicked too loud. The lenses followed him in seamless synchronization, capturing every calculated gesture as if they were documenting history. Behind him, aides in identical charcoal suits carried folders and tablets and the quiet weight of a carefully managed narrative. There was no cheering crowd, no handmade signs, no workers in orange vests or dusty boots. Just a small circle of invited stakeholders, pre-cleared, pre-coached, and politely distant. The mayor was there, but not the town council. The school principal was absent. No shop owners, no veterans, no families with folding chairs hoping for answers. The moment Pete's shoes hit the gravel, one of his aides leaned in, whispering updates from the itinerary. 2 site walkthroughs, a media statement, and a closed-door roundtable. Everything on schedule, everything rehearsed. His expression didn't change as he walked through the quiet town, not because he didn't notice the boarded windows, the sun-faded "we're hiring" signs still taped up from 5 years ago, but because they weren't part of the plan. The real conversations he had told his team would happen with key stakeholders. That phrase was printed on his briefing packet. Key stakeholders, not residents, not families, not the people who waited 6 years for the train that never came. Just names on a spreadsheet, metrics to manage, faces to acknowledge for 15 minutes before the next appointment. He visited the remains of the platform with a camera crew 6 feet behind him. They asked him to pause mid-step so they could get a clean angle of his silhouette against the unfinished beams. He complied. Then he pointed to the structure and nodded solemnly, as if he were mourning something sacred instead of managing something stalled. A state official began explaining a new funding program in vague terms. citing acronyms and urban pilot projects. Pete nodded again. The camera caught it. Someone smiled. A little girl across the street waved, but Pete didn't see her. He was already inside the prefab meeting space, the one with air conditioning and bottled water, where three consultants waited with charts and renderings of something called the Appalachian Multimodal Integration Corridor. The name sounded impressive, but even the consultants struggled to explain what it meant. Pete praised the plan anyway. The cameras caught that too. Outside, the town continued to exist, quietly, stiffly, without participation. Two elderly men watched from the diner window, shaking their heads. A woman sat alone in a pickup truck, engine off, hands locked around the steering wheel, as if holding it gave her something to hold on to. No one approached the podium that had been set up for questions, because no one had been invited to ask any. This wasn't a conversation, it was a broadcast. As Pete posed for the final shot near the station steps, one of the reporters asked gently whether he would be meeting with the local labor union. The aide answered instead, "We're focusing on long-term vision today." The chopper was scheduled to lift again within the hour. The speech was already drafted. The press release had been pre-written 3 days ago. Pete took one last look around Hollow Ridge, not at the people, but at the angles. He nodded once, short and measured, then turned back toward the landing zone. In a town full of voices, still waiting to speak, the only sound left was the rotors winding up again, and the people stayed silent, not because they were impressed, but because they had been muted. J.D. Vance didn't fly in, no chopper, no state escort, no media van trailing behind. He drove himself, 4 hours out of D.C., across winding back roads and through towns with names that never made the news. His car was a dusty Ford sedan with a cracked windshield and a glove box that hadn't closed properly since 2020. There was no advance team, no prepared remarks, no security detail, just boots, jeans, a gray button-down, and a soft leather notebook tucked under his arm with one page inside. Noah's letter. He passed the town's welcome sign, wooden, sun-bleached, chipped around the edges. Beneath it, someone had added a second board with hand-painted letters. Still waiting. J.D. slowed down but didn't stop. He recognized the gesture. Not anger, not defiance, just the kind of dry humor people use when they've run out of reasons to be mad. The streets were quiet, not silent like a ghost town. This wasn't abandonment, it was stillness, lived in stillness. A dog asleep on a porch, a man sweeping dust off a sidewalk no one walked. The only real crowd had been 2 hours earlier, gathered for cameras that had already left. Pete Buttigieg's visit was done. Whatever was said had been said. The town was back to watching itself. J.D. parked near the edge of the station ruins. The sun was high now, hitting the exposed steel beams with a soft glare that made the rust shimmer like old copper. The platform looked smaller in person, shorter, lower, unfinished. A crow perched where a clock should have been. The digital sign above the old ticket window was still blinking 0000. He stepped out of the car, stretched his back, and scanned the area. A few men sat in the shade beneath the station frame, their lunch pails unopened, eyes trained on nothing in particular. They didn't stand when they saw him. They didn't pull out phones. They simply watched. One wore a union patch on a sun-bleached jacket. Another had grease stains on his jeans from a job he no longer had. These were railmen, or used to be. J.D. walked over without a word and took a seat on the edge of a concrete slab beside them. They didn't ask why he came. That part was obvious. One of them, a wiry man in his 60s with a faded Marine's cap and eyes that hadn't blinked in a while, finally spoke. "They came for pictures," he said, voice like gravel. "Not people." J.D. didn't respond right away. He nodded slowly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter, unfolded it, held it gently, not for display, but like it was something fragile. Another man leaned forward. "The kid who wrote that, he lives 2 trailers behind the station. His mom cleans at the diner. Real quiet boy, real smart." J.D. looked at the page. "He asked one question," he said softly. "Why didn't the trains come?" A low chuckle rippled through the group, not with humor, but with the weight of an answer no one bothered to give. "We built half that thing," the veteran said. "Welded it in winter. Got a memo one day to stop. No explanation. Just stop. He took a breath. You know what that does to a man? To work with your hands, then be told nothing? JD kept listening. He asked no questions, took no photos, wrote nothing down. He simply sat among them, a senator without speeches, letting the wind do the talking. Somewhere down the street, a kid rode by on a bike. Noah, though JD didn't know it yet. The boy looked over his shoulder, saw the men by the station, saw the stranger in worn jeans, and kept pedaling. But something in the way the stranger sat made him slow down just a little. Because even though JD hadn't said it, everyone could feel it. This time, someone came to stay. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time Pete Buttigieg and JD Vance found themselves within 10 feet of each other, standing outside the rusted skeleton of Hollow Ridge Station. The camera crews had packed up. The news vans had rolled out. The flash bulbs were gone, but the air still buzzed with static left behind by managed narratives. Pete had finished his official rounds, walking the perimeter with state officials and policy aides, each step carefully calculated, each comment approved in advance. He wasn't expecting to see JD. Not here. Not without a press release. Pete adjusted his cuffs as JD approached, not quickly, but deliberately. The gravel under JD's boots crunched just loud enough to draw attention, and by the time he reached the platform, both men were locked in the kind of eye contact that doesn't start fights, but never avoids them either. They shook hands. It wasn't warm. It wasn't even firm. Just one of those handshakes people give when they've read each other's quotes in the press too many times to pretend otherwise. Pete smiled, habitually. JD didn't. Well, Pete said, glancing around at the now empty site, it's sobering to see it in person. We're evaluating equity outcomes and long-term transit viability across the region. JD didn't blink. They just want their jobs back, he said flatly, voice even, calm but with an edge that didn't need to be raised to cut. Pete's jaw shifted slightly, but his smile held. Of course, and that's part of what we're considering. Economic revitalization is complex. These projects take time, and they've waited 6 years, JD interrupted. That's not complexity. That's neglect. The silence that followed wasn't accidental. It wasn't awkward. It was deliberate. A silence shaped like a dare, stretched tight between two men who had both mastered the art of saying more with what they didn't say. Pete glanced over JD's shoulder toward the road. A few townspeople stood at a distance, pretending not to watch. An older man leaned against a fence post, arms folded. Noah sat cross-legged on the curb, half hidden behind his bike, eyes sharp. Pete cleared his throat. Well, we're making a number of adjustments based on regional metrics. There's a whole layer of implementation policy most people don't see. It's not as simple as... JD took a half step forward, not threatening, not dramatic, just enough to close the space between argument and experience. Most people don't need to see it, he said. They live it, every day. Pete straightened his shoulders. That's why we're here, to gather data, hear voices, and... You had 6 years to hear them, JD cut in again. You didn't need a helicopter to find this place. The tension thickened. Not the kind of confrontation that ends in shouting, but the kind that ends in headlines. One man speaking from frameworks, the other from scars. Pete's aides stood quietly at a distance, eyes shifting, waiting for a cue to step in. But neither man moved. Behind them, the broken station loomed like a metaphor, both too obvious and too painful to say aloud. JD looked toward it, then back to Pete. You saw a project. They saw a future, he said. One of those things still exists. The other's rusting. Pete didn't respond. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he knew whatever he said next would either sound defensive or dismissive, and neither would survive the weight of the silence around them. After a long pause, JD nodded once, not as agreement, but as dismissal, and began walking away. Pete stayed in place, hands clasped behind his back, jaw set, eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to remember how this all spun out of control. The two men had spoken, briefly, politely, sharply, but it wasn't the words that marked the moment. It was everything between them that had been left unsaid. One came to assess outcomes, the other came to confront consequences, and the town was watching. The folding podium had been set up just outside the makeshift tent near the station ruins. A row of local officials stood behind it like furniture, there but uninvited to move. A printed banner with the words "Investing in Our Future" flapped weakly in the wind, trying and failing to distract from the still visible rust behind it. Pete Buttigieg adjusted his notes, tapped the microphone once, and gave the press a trained, practiced half smile. The crowd was modest, curated. Some had stayed out of curiosity. Others had drifted over after hearing that a federal official was speaking again, though few expected to be spoken to. It was the kind of audience designed to observe, not engage. But J.D. Vance wasn't part of the program. He stood just to the right of the crowd, near the gravel path that led toward the old tracks. For a moment it seemed he might simply watch from a distance. Then, without signaling anyone, without clearing it with staff or protocol, he stepped forward, not toward the cameras, toward the people. His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The quiet made it carry. "Before you speak, Secretary Buttigieg," J.D. said, eyes fixed on Pete, "there are 3 questions this town deserves answered." Pete paused. The press turned. Someone lowered a camera from their shoulder. A breeze stirred dust from the platform edge, and everything seemed to still, caught in the fragile second before a collision. J.D. turned slightly so both Pete and the crowd could hear him clearly. "First," he said, "who made the decision to pull the federal funding from this project? And why weren't the people affected ever told?" A murmur rippled across the crowd. One man nodded, another whispered, "That's right." Pete didn't speak. His lips parted, but no sound came yet. J.D. continued. "Second," he said, "where exactly did the money go? Because someone, somewhere, reallocated it. And it wasn't here." Now the murmurs were louder. People leaned in. Cameras angled. A few journalists stepped forward, eyes wide behind their lenses. "Third," J.D. said, steady as ever, "do you believe the lives here matter less because this place isn't profitable?" Pete's expression changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough for anyone watching closely to see the calculations shift behind his eyes. These weren't abstract policy critiques. They were direct, surgical, and public. Each question was a mirror, forcing reflection, exposing discomfort. J.D. didn't move. He didn't explain the questions. He didn't elaborate. He just stood there, arms at his sides, waiting. Not just for answers, but for accountability. Pete stepped back slightly from the mic. One of his aides approached from the side, whispering something, but he didn't respond. His gaze remained on J.D. The crowd now looked at Pete not as a speaker, but as a man under oath. There was no spin here, no moderator, no buffer zone, just 2 public servants and one community that had run out of patience. A woman in the back called out, "Answer him." Then someone else, "Tell the truth." J.D. didn't turn to acknowledge them. He kept his eyes on Pete, not with anger, but with something quieter and far more dangerous: expectation. For a long moment, Pete said nothing. Then just before he opened his mouth, J.D. spoke once more, softer this time. "That's all they want," he said. "An honest answer, not a slogan, not a photo, just an answer." He stepped back into the crowd, disappearing among them. No podium, no applause, no exit music. Pete was left alone at the microphone, his notes suddenly useless, the silence in front of him louder than the applause he had expected. And in that silence, a press conference became something else entirely. For a moment, after J.D. stepped back into the crowd, it was quiet, too quiet. Pete Buttigieg remained at the podium, gripping the edges with both hands. The printed speech in front of him suddenly less like a plan and more like a shield. The reporters shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to record or retreat. The local officials behind him stood frozen, their practiced smiles fading into uncertainty. Pete cleared his throat and tried to recover the moment. "We're committed to investing in long-term infrastructure solutions for underserved communities," he began, voice a touch too steady, too measured. "This region, like many others, has faced logistical challenges, but our administration—" He didn't get to finish. From the left side of the makeshift crowd, a woman's voice cut through the stillness like a knife through cloth. "You didn't answer him!" Every head turned. She stood with her daughter on her hip, hair pulled into a rushed ponytail, eyes locked on Pete with a fury not born of politics, but of waiting. The girl in her arms looked no older than 3, wearing a shirt 2 sizes too big and clutching a broken plastic toy. Pete looked up, startled. "Ma'am, if I may continue—" "No," she said, stepping forward. "He asked you 3 questions. You didn't answer 1. You think we came here for talking points?" The crowd shifted, stirred. What had begun as a stage press moment had changed, quietly, rapidly, into something far less controlled. More people arrived. Word had spread, quickly and without invitation. They came in work boots, ball caps, uniforms faded by time. Veterans, teachers, factory men, mothers, sons. A few held their phones, not to film, but just in case someone tried to pretend later that this never happened. A man in the back shouted, "Say where the money went." Another, "Did you ever plan to finish the station?" Pete tried again. "I assure you, we are reviewing all financial allocations. The decision-making process involves multiple levels of departmental—" A groan rolled through the crowd like thunder rumbling before a storm. "No more departments," someone yelled. "Talk like a person." The words hit harder than they should have. Pete faltered, blinking, checking his notes as if the answer might be buried between bullet points. Behind him, one of his aides leaned in again, whispering, urgently this time. But Pete didn't move. He couldn't. The crowd wasn't hostile, not yet, but it was no longer polite. It was awake. What had started as murmurs had become voices. What had been passive had become pointed. J.D. Vance remained somewhere in the second row, arms crossed, saying nothing. He didn't need to. The people had taken up the echo themselves. Pete raised a hand, as if to lower the volume of the room, but no one obeyed. He looked out, not at the reporters, not at his aides, but at the ones no one had prepared him for. The welder with soot on his jeans, the cashier in scrubs, the man in a wheelchair holding a folder labeled Project Timeline, 2018. He looked at the young mother again. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now, like he was reaching for a life jacket in rough water. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. This wasn't about her name. It was about the fact that for the first time in 6 years, she had been seen, and she refused to be reduced to a checkbox again. Pete looked back down at his speech. Then slowly, wordlessly, he folded it in half. And the sound of paper creasing was louder than anything he had said all afternoon. Pete Buttigieg stood behind the podium, the folded speech still in his hands, the weight of the moment hanging heavier than any script could hold. The crowd had stopped murmuring, but not because they were satisfied. They were waiting, staring, daring him to speak without saying anything that sounded like politics. The wind caught the edge of the banner behind him, "Investing in our future," and flipped one corner backward, like even the sign was reconsidering its words. Pete looked out across the faces, lined with sun, with age, with fatigue, and his voice didn't come. His fingers twitched slightly against the edge of the microphone, and for the first time that afternoon, the man who had arrived by air seemed ungrounded. Then J.D. stepped forward again. No stage, no permission, no need. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look at the press. He spoke straight ahead, eyes fixed not on Pete, but on the people. "We don't need headlines," J.D. said. "We need trains." It was 5 words, simple, sharp, unmistakable, and it landed like thunder in the chest of everyone standing within earshot. There was a beat of silence, real silence, not confusion, not hesitation, but the moment when people realized someone just said exactly what they were thinking. Then it came. The crowd erupted, not in cheers of celebration, but in the collective release of being understood. Someone clapped once, then again, then louder. A man pumped his fist in the air. The young mother with the daughter on her hip nodded, her eyes glassy. A retired conductor shouted, "That's it," as if confirming a truth too long buried. And in the middle of it all, a cameraman who had been perched near the press risers slowly lowered his lens. Not because he missed the shot, but because, for once, it wasn't for the camera. It was real, and it didn't need to be zoomed in to be felt. Pete took a step back. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't defensive, but it was undeniable. For the first time, control had slipped from his hands. The podium, the microphones, the prep memos, all of it became meaningless in the face of 5 words that came from a place deeper than any policy. JD didn't gloat. He didn't move. He simply let the words do what they came to do: shift the air. Because that line wasn't just for Pete. It was for the man who had driven 40 minutes on a borrowed tank of gas just to hear something honest. For the grandmother who remembered when this town had 4 trains a day and a future in steel. For Noah sitting cross-legged on the curb, eyes locked on the man who had spoken like truth still mattered. It wasn't just the delivery, it was the timing, the vacuum, the need. Pete looked out again, this time not with control but with recognition. Not everything could be deflected. Not everything could be explained. And not every story could be managed. Some had to be heard. And the people weren't done. From the back of the crowd, a man shouted, "Why'd you stop the project?" Another woman added, "We were supposed to have jobs by now." The voices were no longer scattered. They were building, layered with the kind of anger that only grows in silence and broken promises. JD stepped back again, not to retreat, but to let the people speak for themselves. Pete turned toward his aides, then stopped. There was nowhere to hide from this. Not today, not anymore. This wasn't a press stop. This was a reckoning. And all it took to start was one line. By the time Pete Buttigieg's motorcade pulled back through the gates of the Department of Transportation, the headlines had already taken shape. Confrontation in Hollow Ridge, tense exchange between locals and secretary, and more subtly, emotions flare at rural infrastructure site. The footage hadn't even aired in full, yet the angles were being crafted, the phrases rehearsed, the narrative constructed. Within 24 hours, Pete was behind another podium, this one in D.C., encased in sleek white walls, flanked by flags, facing a press corps more accustomed to scripted policy than raw confrontation. His tie was a shade darker, his posture straighter, the energy more measured. "We remain deeply committed to rural development," he began, the teleprompter blinking rhythmically just behind the cameras. "But yesterday's events in Hollow Ridge remind us of the complexities and tensions that often accompany progress. While we understand the frustrations felt by many residents, we must also acknowledge the importance of maintaining a respectful, solutions-oriented dialogue." He didn't mention the folded speech. He didn't mention the 3 questions. He didn't mention J.D. Vance. But the implication was clear. There was some aggressive behavior from individuals who may have misunderstood the scope and sequence of our evaluation process. Pete continued, hands calmly folded on the podium, his voice walking the tightrope between authority and damage control. "We regret any miscommunication and remain open to further engagement under the right conditions." Aggressive behavior, miscommunication, right conditions. Words designed to sound calm while quietly moving blame elsewhere. Behind the glass, aides whispered to one another, refreshing news feeds, monitoring reactions. In internal memos, Hollow Ridge was now referred to as a high-sensitivity site. Reports were drafted using passive voice. Tensions were observed. Unexpected public remarks were delivered. No names, no responsibility, just the language of bureaucratic deflection. J.D. Vance watched the press conference from his office on the Hill, the volume low but the captions clear. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, not surprised, just disappointed in how predictable the performance had become. Pete wasn't lying, not exactly. He was just editing, trimming the truth until it fit neatly inside the approved margins. Outside J.D.'s door, a staffer paused, holding a stack of letters. She looked in but didn't speak. J.D. waved her in. She placed them gently on his desk. 30 new envelopes, all handwritten, all from towns J.D. had never visited but already recognized. "Looks like the word's getting out," she said. J.D. nodded. His eyes stayed on the screen. Pete was taking questions now. A reporter asked whether federal funding might still be restored to the Hollow Ridge site. "We're reviewing all allocations," Pete answered. "That region remains part of our long-term strategic outlook." Not yes, not no, just another placeholder sentence, clean, empty, and designed to vanish. He stepped away from the podium minutes later, escorted by aides and swallowed by the marble halls of the department he led. There would be no follow-up, no acknowledgement that the crowd had spoken louder than the speech. No reference to the man who had said 5 words that still echoed far louder than any press release. JD sat quietly for another few moments, then turned off the screen. He reached for the top letter in the new stack. The handwriting was messy. There were oil smudges near the corners. But the message was clear. They didn't show up. You did. He smiled. Not because it was victory, but because it was clarity. And in D.C., clarity was power, especially when the official narrative was already drifting away from the truth. By the next morning, the Hollow Ridge confrontation had been sliced, packaged, and repurposed for national consumption. Network after network aired the footage, but not the whole footage. Not the 3 questions, not the silence that followed, not the line that turned the crowd. What the public saw was a carefully curated snippet. Pete Buttigieg at the podium, J.D. Vance stepping forward unexpectedly, the beginnings of a confrontation, then a hard cut and a return to commentary from suited anchors in warm-tone studios. The headlines were predictable. Tensions rise in infrastructure visit. Senator interrupts federal address in rural town. On social media, the narrative fragmented further. Hashtags climbed the trending list. Hashtag grandstanding, hashtag political theater, hashtag stunt politics. Talking heads speculated on motive, decorum, and appropriate venues for discourse. Few mentioned the station, fewer mentioned the town. J.D. Vance didn't call a press conference. He uploaded the full unedited video himself. A single camera, grainy, steady, had captured the entire exchange from the second he stepped out of the crowd to the moment Pete folded his speech. It showed the questions, the hesitation, the woman yelling, the crowd awakening. It showed Pete looking out, not at a political opponent, but at the reality he'd avoided. It showed truth, unguarded, unedited. JD didn't add commentary. He didn't attach a logo. He posted it on his personal account with just one caption. They didn't mute me, they muted them. Within an hour, the video had 100,000 views. By noon, it had 500,000. By evening, it had reached over 2 million. People recognized something in it, not politics, but presence. They saw themselves in the worn faces, in the unfinished station, in the frustration that had no party lines. The most shared moment wasn't JD speaking. It was the crowd responding. The cheer that wasn't joy, but release. The silence that wasn't confusion, but recognition. Major outlets responded swiftly, but not directly. A well-known cable host called JD's move reckless populism. Another labeled it strategic outrage. A White House correspondent dismissed the video as edited for drama, ironic considering the original broadcast had been edited for containment. Inside JD's office, the phones rang nonstop. Some were reporters, some were colleagues, most were strangers. A factory worker from Pennsylvania left a voicemail. "We've been waiting for someone to say it like that." A retired teacher from Indiana wrote, "I never trusted the headlines. Now I know why." A veteran from West Virginia emailed, "That wasn't political. That was human." JD sat at his desk, watching the comments flood in beneath the post. He didn't refresh obsessively. He didn't celebrate. He knew this wasn't a win. It was exposure. And exposure in politics didn't guarantee change. It only guaranteed resistance. He leaned back in his chair and turned toward the letter still pinned to his bulletin board. Noah's letter, the same one that started it all. It hadn't faded, not yet, but the corners were curling slightly from the air conditioning. JD stared at the last line. "Just tell me you got this." A staffer knocked lightly and stepped in. "Some networks want you to come on tonight," she said. "Respond live. CNN, Fox, PBS, they're all asking." JD thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No, that's what they want. Back and forth. Headlines. They already cut the story once. I'm not letting them rewrite it again." The staffer hesitated. "So? Nothing?" He looked at the screen, then back at the letter. "No, not nothing," he said. "We keep showing the whole thing. Because if the country was finally watching, they deserved more than 15 seconds of filtered outrage. They deserved the truth, every second of it. The news trucks didn't come back. The podiums were packed away. The banner, investing in our future, was taken down, rolled up, and stored in a federal storage facility, forgotten among 100 other props from 100 other towns. For a few days, Hollow Ridge had been a headline. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it slipped from the cycle. The town slipped with it. Construction remained halted. No new crews arrived. No updates were posted. The platform sat still beneath a sky that no longer seemed to expect answers. Weeds began to push through the cracks again, growing like truth does, slow, quiet, and ignored. The letters came less often now. The ones sent to D.C. by teachers, laborers, town clerks, all went unanswered, no replies, no acknowledgments. Some were returned unopened. Some vanished into federal channels too complex to track. The people of Hollow Ridge had raised their voices once, and when nothing changed, they did what they'd learned to do best. They went quiet, but not everyone. Noah sat on the floor of his trailer home, a school folder spread open in front of him. His mother cooked silently in the kitchen, the smell of canned soup, faint but familiar. The television played softly in the background, something political, something far away. He didn't look up. He was writing again. Not a school assignment, not for grades, just another letter folded neatly, the handwriting firmer now, like he was older than the last time he wrote. He wrote, "I saw you ask him the questions. Thank you. But nothing's changed here. They came and left like always. The station still sits there like it's waiting for someone who won't ever show up. My dad doesn't even look at it anymore. He just says we tried. So I want to ask something I don't know how to ask out loud. Do we matter less because we didn't yell?" He signed his name again. No return address, just the name of the town, and beneath it, one sentence. "I hope you still got this." JD read the letter 2 nights later. His chief of staff had placed it at the top of the stack, even though she knew it wasn't official correspondence. JD unfolded the page slowly, like it deserved reverence. He read it once, then again. Then he turned his chair away from the glowing monitor, away from the headlines, away from the noise. "Do we matter less because we didn't yell?" The line landed like a punch to the gut, because it didn't accuse, didn't scream, didn't blame. It just asked, quietly, earnestly, the way people ask when they've run out of reasons to keep believing in answers. He stared out the window for a long time. The Capitol dome shimmered in the distance, majestic and untouched. He thought about the meetings scheduled for the next day, the hearings, the interviews. All of it felt small. He looked at the letter again. Then he stood up. This couldn't end here. Not with a viral clip, not with a half-folded podium, not with silence returning like a tide swallowing the story. He walked to the bookshelf, pulled down a large map of the U.S., and cleared a space on the wall. With a thumbtack, he pinned Noah's letter in the center. Then he reached for the rest of the unopened mail. If Washington wouldn't answer these voices, he would, because the truth didn't stop mattering just because the cameras turned off, and the people who didn't yell still deserved to be heard. The chamber was quiet, not the kind of silence that follows agreement, but the kind that brews before impact. J.D. Vance stood alone at the podium, holding a single sheet of paper, slightly creased, folded in thirds. It wasn't an official document. It bore no seal, but as he raised it in his hand, the weight it carried became undeniable. "I'd like to read something into the record," he began, his voice even, deliberate. "It's not legislation. It's not a press statement. It's a letter from a 12-year-old boy, from a town you've probably never visited." Some senators shifted in their seats. Others looked down at their tablets. But JD didn't pause. He unfolded the letter and read it aloud. "We waited. They forgot. The station is still empty. My dad says we tried. So I want to ask something I don't know how to ask out loud. Do we matter less because we didn't yell? Noah, Hollow Ridge, Appalachia." He looked up, scanning the room. "This isn't about trains," he said, his voice louder now. "It's about trust." The word echoed across the marble walls like a charge. JD stepped closer to the mic. "We sold these people a promise. We gave them ribbon cuttings and media sound bites. We let them believe, even if just for a moment, that they were seen. And then we vanished. We funneled money elsewhere, prioritized projects in places where headlines were easier to control. You want to know why they stopped writing letters? Because they knew no one was reading." He slammed the flat of his palm on the lectern, startling even those pretending not to listen. "I'm calling for a full federal inquiry," he declared, "into the infrastructure funds earmarked for Appalachia, into the sudden redirection of resources, into the towns that never saw the benefits of the laws passed in their name." One senator raised an eyebrow. Another cleared their throat. But JD didn't stop. "I don't care if it makes some people uncomfortable. I don't care if it pokes the wrong beehives. What I care about is that a 12-year-old boy had to wonder if he mattered, because silence was the only answer we gave him." The chamber now held its breath. It was no longer just JD speaking. It was a voice cracking through years of formality, daring someone to challenge not just the facts, but the failure behind them. He held up the letter again, visibly worn from handling. "This is not fiction. This is not theater. This is what remains when the press leaves and the project stalls. This letter is more honest than half the speeches I've heard in this room all year." A murmur rippled through the gallery seats above. JD stepped back, voice calm again, but eyes unflinching. "You all want to talk about unity? About restoring the American spirit? Then start by telling the truth. Start by admitting that the people we forget are the people we owe the most." He paused, then folded the letter carefully and placed it on the podium like it was a sacred text. Noah's not asking for favors. He's not asking for votes. He's asking for one thing only: to be heard. And with that, he left the floor, not with applause, but with silence thick enough to feel. Not one senator followed him out. Not yet. But in the days to come, clips of his speech would spread. News anchors would stumble over the name Hollow Ridge. And in homes across forgotten parts of the country, the line would echo, "Do we matter less because we didn't yell?" It was no longer a question, it was a reckoning. 3 days after JD's speech on the Senate floor, the voicemail inbox at his office reached capacity before noon. By the end of the week, a new mail cart had to be borrowed from the Department of Agriculture just to keep up with the handwritten letters arriving by the hour. Noah's words, "Do we matter less because we didn't yell?" had cracked something open in the American conscience. But JD didn't just wait for the country to listen. He gave it a way to speak. He called it Letters from the Ground, a single web page. No flashy graphics, no campaign-style slogans. Just a quiet call for anyone in any town who had witnessed something go quiet: an unfinished bridge, a shuttered post office, a delayed school repair project, to write in. Not to a department, but to him directly, to the Senate, to someone who wouldn't delete it after the first sentence. And the country answered. A veteran from Oklahoma sent a letter written in block print describing a VA clinic that had closed for remodeling 2 years ago and never reopened. A teacher from rural Nevada attached photos of a classroom with duct tape around every window and a generator that hadn't worked since spring. A retired coal miner from West Virginia wrote, "They sent us promises by train and took them away by truck." Some letters were only a few lines. Others were full essays. Some came typed, others scribbled in pencil on scraps of paper or torn notebook pages. One envelope had no return address, just the words, "We were loud once. Now we're tired." JD read as many as he could himself. Often late at night, alone in his office, his sleeves rolled up, surrounded by boxes of unsorted envelopes. He didn't ask his staff to filter them by region or politics. It didn't matter who voted red or blue. The silence was bipartisan. And so was the pain. By the end of the second week, the initiative had collected over 14,000 submissions. They came from 48 states, with more arriving by the hour. One intern joked they needed a second zip code. Another began pinning paper flags to a wall map in JD's office, marking where each letter came from. Within days, the map looked like it had been caught in a blizzard of tiny cries for help. But amid the avalanche of hardship, there was a different kind of power beginning to emerge. These weren't just complaints. They were confessions, testimonies, the kind of unfiltered truth that politicians usually never hear because they don't know how to ask. News outlets began picking it up. First small local newspapers, then national morning shows. One segment simply read 5 letters, back to back, with no commentary. The silence that followed said more than any anchor could. In Hollow Ridge, Noah sat at his kitchen table, watching his mother wipe tears from her cheeks as JD's speech aired again on a loop. She didn't say anything. She just touched his shoulder, as if to say, "You did this." And somewhere in the White House press briefing room, a question was finally asked. Not about polling numbers, not about political blowback, but about the map behind JD's desk. "Has anyone read the letters yet?" a journalist asked. No one had an answer. Back in his office, JD held a new envelope postmarked from Oregon. He opened it slowly as if unwrapping something sacred. Inside were 6 words scribbled in blue ink. "We didn't yell. You listened anyway." He closed his eyes for a moment, taking it in. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a quiet smile. Not of victory, but of purpose. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the first time someone fought back by listening. By the 3rd week, the letters no longer came in boxes. They came on pallets. Volunteers from local universities helped JD's office scan and archive the submissions. His staff converted a spare conference room into what they half-joked was America's complaint desk. But JD didn't laugh. He was already preparing for what came next. The spark he had lit on the Senate floor was now a wildfire. A bipartisan wave of outrage swept through committee halls and press rooms. Republican and Democratic senators alike, some moved by political pressure, others by genuine concern, began asking, where did the infrastructure money go? Why were small towns becoming cemeteries of unfulfilled federal promises? The Transportation Oversight Committee, once a quiet body rarely in the headlines, was suddenly flooded with requests to investigate. And then came the formal vote. In a rare show of unity, the committee agreed there would be a federal hearing, witnesses would be called, records demanded, and Pete Buttigieg would be subpoenaed. The announcement hit the headlines like a thunderclap. News anchors used phrases like turning point, national reckoning, and rural revolt. In Hollow Ridge, locals watched in silence as Pete's name flashed on the bottom of their screens. No one cheered, but no one looked away either. In Washington, the stakes had changed. This wasn't about a photo op gone wrong anymore. This was about federal oversight, public accountability, and political survival. Pete's team scrambled, issuing controlled statements about miscommunication and data discrepancies, while quietly attempting to shift blame onto state agencies. But it was too late. The story had passed the point of spin. JD sat in his office, sleeves rolled, elbows on the table, eyes scanning a stack of prepared questions. But what he was building wasn't just a line of inquiry, it was a case. Not against a man, but against a mindset, a culture of polished detachment, of technocratic distance. One that had made transportation into a spreadsheet and forgotten the people who still waited at empty stations. He pulled out Noah's second letter again. "Do we matter less because we didn't yell?" That sentence stayed with him. It wasn't political. It wasn't even angry. It was a child's honest confusion about what justice looked like in America. And JD knew it would be his closing line. Down the hall, staffers drafted subpoenas, coordinated with the committee's legal counsel, and compiled logistics for the televised hearing. But JD's focus was elsewhere. He had already reviewed hundreds of pages of budgets and interagency memos. He had seen the gaps, funds diverted, timelines delayed, language softened. But numbers were not what moved people. Stories did. So he returned to the map, the one covered in paper flags. He began selecting letters, not the loudest, not the most dramatic, but the clearest. A 3rd-grade teacher from Pennsylvania, a retired welder from Indiana, a tribal liaison from New Mexico. Each would become part of his message, each a spotlight. That night, as Capitol Hill lights flickered across the mall, a reporter cornered JD outside his office. "Senator, what should the country expect from this hearing?" JD didn't pause. They should expect the truth, and they should expect someone to finally be held responsible for forgetting the places that don't make the news. He walked away before the next question could be asked, because in just 4 days, cameras would roll again. Only this time, not in a small town, not outside a rusting train station, but inside the heart of the Capitol. And this time, JD wouldn't just be listening, he'd be asking the questions no one could walk away from. By morning, the line outside the Capitol stretched for 2 blocks. Reporters clutched hot coffees and microphones, jostling for angles. Producers barked into earpieces. Boom mics hovered like vultures above elected heads. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was theater, and everyone wanted front row. Inside room 406 of the Dirksen Senate office building buzzed with electricity. The committee dais stood like a judge's bench, flanked by flags and faces taut with calculation. TV crews had set up hours earlier. Every seat was filled. Overflow rooms streamed the session live to staffers, students, and constituents across the country. Pete Buttigieg entered quietly, flanked by aides in sharp suits. He adjusted his tie, nodded politely to colleagues, and settled into his seat with the calm of a man used to spotlights. In front of him lay a neatly tabbed binder, glossy printouts, pie charts, and poll-tested phrasing. He wore the expression of someone ready to explain it all away. Across from him, J.D. Vance walked in alone. He wore no tie, just a dark suit and rolled sleeves. In his hand, a single worn folder. No staffers, no whispering aides, no digital tablet to lean on. He sat down slowly, nodding once to the chairman, then to the others on the panel. When his eyes met Pete's, there was no animosity, just clarity. The chairman gavelled in. Cameras clicked like rainfall on glass. Pete was invited to speak first. He launched into his opening remarks smoothly. His voice was polished, each sentence pre-cleared and safe. "We've made significant progress," he said. "Rural access is a priority. Miscommunication, yes, but not neglect." His hands moved like a conductor's baton over his notes. "The department remains committed to transparency and results." Noah's name was never mentioned. No images of Hollow Ridge. No acknowledgement of the hearing's origin. Just data points and phrasing, built to soothe and defer. When he finished, the room gave a light murmur. Some nodded. Others looked down at their phones. Then J.D. stood. He didn't have notes. He didn't clear his throat. He opened the folder and held up a child's letter. Creased, handwritten in pencil, one corner stained with something that looked like grape juice. "This is what started it," J.D. said, holding the letter without explanation. "It's not a statistic. It's not a talking point. It's a 12-year-old asking if he was forgotten." He placed it on the table gently. "I didn't come here for a speech," J.D. continued, "and I didn't come here to trade barbs with a cabinet secretary. I came here because towns like Hollow Ridge still believe that someone, somewhere, will listen." He looked directly at Pete. "You never mentioned the boy, or the town, or the missing funds, but we're not going to talk around it today." He opened the folder further. "I have 3 questions. They don't come from me. They come from the letters your department never answered." He glanced at the committee. "And I'm going to read them out loud." In that moment, the room changed. The air slowed. Even the cameras stopped panning. Pete shifted slightly in his seat. His aides leaned forward, pens suddenly still. For the first time, silence wasn't background noise. It was anticipation. J.D. raised the first letter, and with it, the weight of forgotten places came crashing into the center of power. J.D. didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The stillness in the hearing room had settled into a tension thick enough to taste. Fingers froze mid-type. The only sound was the faint hum of the cameras broadcasting to millions across the country. He opened the folder once more and removed a set of stapled papers. Black and white, no headers, no gloss. Just the kind of dry bureaucratic language that no one was ever supposed to read out loud. "This," J.D. began, holding up the first page, "is an internal memorandum from the Department of Transportation, dated 11 months ago. It never saw the light of day. Until now." Pete's brow creased slightly. His aides exchanged looks, sharp, silent, alarmed. J.D. read calmly. "In regions with insufficient population density, infrastructure allocations should be reevaluated for ROI optimization. That's Washington speak for, let them rot." A ripple moved through the room. One senator lowered his glasses. Another looked up from her phone. J.D. placed the first memo on the table and picked up the second. "This one's worse." He didn't dramatize it. He didn't have to. "Redirect proposed Appalachian rail expansions to metro corridors with higher visibility. Minimal political fallout expected in low engagement zones." He paused. "Low engagement zones. That's how your office labeled Hollow Ridge, and a dozen other towns like it." Gasps echoed across the room. Audible now human. No longer just an audience. Witnesses. Pete shifted in his seat. He opened his mouth but said nothing. There was nothing in the binder that prepared him for this. JD didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply laid the second memo beside the first, hands steady. These aren't attacks, they're receipts. The kind America's been waiting to see. He glanced up at the chairman. These were submitted through a protected whistleblower, verified, time-stamped, and scrubbed from all public briefings. Pete finally leaned forward, voice quiet but tight. Senator Vance, you're mischaracterizing high-level planning conversations that had context. JD didn't flinch. You mean context like this? He flipped one more page. A spreadsheet. Here's a list of proposed projects. Urban upgrades, 4 completed. Rural expansions, 0. But here's the kicker. Your office marked towns like Hollow Ridge as unfavorable messaging zones. That's not context. That's contempt. The room was no longer listening to Pete. He could have read a poem or a prayer, and no one would have heard. All attention had shifted to the quiet fire in JD's voice and the cold clarity of what was now on record. Reporters were already tweeting. Screens lit up across the gallery. Someone whispered, "This'll be front page by sunset." Pete sat back in his chair, fingers folded, no longer defiant, just stunned. JD closed the folder softly. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone," he said, glancing at the senators around him. "But the people who wrote those memos already embarrassed this government. I'm just making sure they don't do it again." Then he looked at Pete, not with hatred, but with a kind of stern, weary grace. "Secretary Buttigieg, these people didn't ask for a fight. They asked for a platform. I just gave it back to them." Silence fell again, but this time it didn't feel oppressive. It felt earned, like something sacred had been said out loud. And somewhere in the hills of Appalachia, a boy named Noah, watching on a borrowed school tablet, whispered 2 words to himself under his breath. He heard. The room had gone from tense to breathless. Even the committee members, veterans of hearings designed more for posturing than truth, sat straighter now. Pete Buttigieg, once composed behind his polished rhetoric, now avoided JD's gaze. And JD, he didn't even pause to catch his breath. He was done playing by Capitol Hill's rules of polite concealment. "This wasn't neglect," JD said, voice steady but cutting. "It was deliberate." The words landed like a hammer. No euphemisms, no bureaucratic cushioning, just the raw truth, spoken into a space where evasion had been the norm. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. JD held up the final document, Noah's second letter, crumpled at the edges, written in crooked, hopeful lines. "Do we matter less because we didn't yell?" JD read aloud. Then he looked up at the panel. "You just heard them yell. Every town, every veteran, every farmer who thought their silence was the problem." He laid the letter down gently, like something sacred, then folded his hands and looked across the table one last time. "To every family in a forgotten ZIP code, this hearing wasn't about rail lines. It was about respect, and we're long past due." The committee chair, clearly rattled but composed, tapped the gavel once. "In light of today's disclosures," he said slowly, "this committee will formally recommend a full federal investigation into the Department of Transportation's rural allocation strategies." Gasps, then applause. Not from the public gallery, but from inside the hearing room itself. Even a few lawmakers nodded, their expressions unreadable, but no longer indifferent. Pete didn't speak again. His silence was louder than anything he might have said. JD gathered his folder, no stack of prepared remarks, no staffers waiting to debrief. He simply stood, nodded once to the chairman, and walked out of the room the same way he entered. Alone. No victory lap. No grandstanding. But the story had already escaped the room. By the time he stepped outside, the headlines had begun. Phones buzzed, alerts chimed, phrases like explosive hearing, Vance exposes internal memos, and Buttigieg under fire were already trending. Outside, a cluster of reporters surged forward, shouting questions. JD said nothing. He didn't need to, because the truth was already moving faster than any motorcade. And back in Hollow Ridge at a dusty school desk in the last row, Noah sat with a tablet in his lap, eyes wide. For the first time, he wasn't waiting for a train. He was watching the world turn toward his town. Months later, construction quietly resumed in the Appalachian town. Dust rose where silence once settled. Workers returned, laying steel with purpose. J.D. Vance drove in alone, unannounced, watching from his parked car across the street. There were no speeches, no cameras, only the hum of progress. Noah spotted him through the window. The boy ran over, breathless, holding a new letter. "They heard," it read simply. J.D. smiled faintly, nodded once, and drove off before anyone else noticed. The town didn't need a spectacle. It just needed someone to listen and someone to move. The envelope came without a return address, but the mayor of Hollow Ridge recognized the seal instantly. It wasn't grand, just a folded page with a brief typed message. No televised statement, no press release. It read, "To the people of Hollow Ridge, I was wrong to show up only for cameras. We missed the moment, but not again. I hope this finds a place not on a podium, but somewhere real." Signed simply, Pete Buttigieg. The mayor, a wiry man with calloused hands and a cautious heart, stood in the new station with the letter. He looked at the polished concrete, the benches still in plastic wrap, the gleaming digital board that hadn't yet displayed its first arrival. Then he walked to the eastern wall, still unfinished, and slipped the letter behind the drywall beneath the final panel, sealing it with one firm press. No plaque, no spotlight, just a decision. The apology would stay hidden, permanent in its own way, a whisper between stone and steel. When the workers asked what he was doing, he shrugged. History doesn't always need to be loud. Later, someone carved 3 words into the wet cement near the entrance, small and almost invisible unless you were looking for them, "Never again forgotten." And just like that, a letter meant for repair became part of the foundation. It was early morning when J.D. stepped off the platform. No escort, no suit, just a brown jacket, jeans, and that worn folder in his hand. The station buzzed with quiet activity, commuters sipping coffee, a conductor checking his watch, a teenager snapping a photo in front of the new mural that stretched across the back wall. A winding rail cutting through golden hills with the words, "We were worth the steel," painted above it. J.D. walked to the edge of the platform and looked out over the tracks. They shone like rivers of light in the rising sun. For a moment, he said nothing. He just stood still. A voice behind him spoke up. "You weren't loud," said an old man in a faded work coat, "but you were clear." J.D. turned. The man had oil on his hands and a badge on his cap from the old railway union. A railman from a time before things had gone quiet. J.D. smiled, shook the man's hand. No words were needed. Respect exchanged in the old language, eye contact and grit. Inside the station, a small exhibit had been set up. Just one glass case near the entrance. 2 letters side by side. One was wrinkled, written in a boy's hand. The other was typed, concise. A placard read, "Letters that move steel." Noah, now taller, stood nearby with his class. He looked over, beamed, then placed a 3rd letter between the 2. This one simply said, "What you write can move the world." J.D. stood back, taking it in. He knew he wouldn't return. Not because the fight was over, but because the town didn't need him here anymore. It had its own voice now, and it was just getting started. This story reminds us that true change rarely begins with noise. It starts with one quiet voice that refuses to be ignored. J.D. didn't chase headlines and Noah didn't demand attention, but together they reignited motion in a place long forgotten. It's proof that dignity and action can meet in silence and still echo across the nation. What would your letter say if you knew someone in power would finally read it? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.